Appropriation Bill, and I call the honourable member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and it's a privilege to be able to stand up and address the Appropriations Bill, and particularly the case for it and the substance of it, rather than, unfortunately, some of the critique we have just heard, where it's been indulged with the spin that might make people feel good about themselves but not on the substance. There are a number of measures within this budget for which I strongly support. For instance, one of the things that perhaps slipped the headlines, but is an extremely important part of the budget, is that there is essentially a tax cut for Australia's future workforce. In the budget, the government announced it would not be drawing down from the Future Fund. When it was announced in 2005 by then-Treasurer Peter Costello, he said that the Future Fund was established to, quote, fund the liabilities, meaning public sector pensions, we have already incurred but not yet made provision to pay for, with the intention no government will be able to draw the money out of it until it's sufficient to meet all the unfunded liabilities. The intention was that the contributions would of course be made from surpluses from the 2007 budget onwards. But what we know in practice is that, apart from additional contributions from the sale of Telstra shares, that never occurred. Costello said in 2007, in his 2007 budget speech, that, quote, if you rob capital or earnings from the Future Fund, taxpayers will have to make up the difference. You are passing our bills, our obligations from one generation to the next, and this will limit their future, end quote. And he was as right then as that principle and statement is now. And in this budget, the Coalition has deferred drawing down from the Future Fund from 2020 until 2026. And if drawn down earlier, the Future Fund would only be able to cover liabilities for the next 20-odd years. A 6-year delay ensures it will mature and fund liabilities for the next century, and amounts to an effective tax cut for over a century, with the primary beneficiaries being those aged less than 20 years older than today. So when I hear the pointless and needless rhetoric from the opposition leader about a class war, or a war against young people, what I'm not hearing is his commitment to support the measure by the government to delay drawing down from the Future Fund, and that should he be elected government at some point in the future, that somehow that they would not seek to raid the Future Fund. Because what we know is they have formed in the past where they've sought to go about ways to do it, whether it's through the principle of developing national broadband network as a justification to extract money from there, or to find other measures that may give justification to raid the Future Fund for their political benefit. There is, of course, also another important measure within the budget around the instant asset write-off for small businesses. And coming from an electorate with thousands of small businesses, of entrepreneurs coming together to create small businesses and invest in the future so that they can not just take care of themselves, provide goods and services to the marketplace, but also to employ people, to create an economy built off the ingenuity and energy of people, and to employ others so that they may stand on their own 2 feet. The continuation of the instant asset write-off is enormously beneficial for the people of Goldstein, but not just the people of Goldstein, but the people they seek to employ from within our community and from without. Another contentious measure that has raised its head throughout the debate around the budget has been the introduction of a bank levy. And I'll concede that perhaps introducing a bank levy is never my first preference. But when it comes down to the reality of how banks operate and the capacity for a levy to be introduced to reflect some of the aspects of their enjoyment from guarantees in the past, which have lowered the rate at which they're able to borrow capital, particularly in comparison to smaller banks, I don't think it is an outrageous proposition. The banking levy does do something to try and create a level playing field between larger and smaller banks, though I think there is a case from time to time to look at how the operation of this levy operates, of course, with the intention that my personal preference was that it would not exist for a long time into the future, particularly because of its contribution towards dealing with issues around deficit and debt reduction. There have been a lot of arguments on the political left about this budget, and of course they've been using all sorts of perpetual arguments about fairness as a justification for supporting one measure or another, often with heated rhetoric and little substance. And we just, as I said, heard a large chunk of that in the speech prior. But what this budget seeks to do is redress and rebalance some of the issues that face our country in making sure that there is proper investment in things like education and protecting those people who are most vulnerable and can do little to improve their circumstances, particularly by fully funding the National Disability Insurance Scheme and the consummate measures in the Medicare levy. But this budget is only the beginning, in my opinion. It must be seen as an opportunity to refocus and refresh the discussion around the future of our country, because if you want to protect people, young people, and their interests into the future, we do need to have an honest discussion about the budget and an honest discussion about the growth of expenditure and where it is coming from. In the past, governments that have been elected have been able to focus on welfare reform to get people back to work, to privatise assets and introduce revenue into the government to pay down debt. That is not the challenge that we face today. And until we as a country take that issue seriously and what is actually driving our expenditure, not just the nature of debt and how it's created, we will not be able to hand on to future generations the type of country for which we have inherited. Because there's a lot of discussion around curbing back middle-class welfare and the like, particularly from the opposition, which of course they invariably mean is a code for reducing assistance to income-earning families, to assist them in staying in employment and creating and building their own lives and their own Australian dream and being able to stand as much as possible on their own 2 feet. At some point, this country needs to have a very serious discussion about the real growth and where it's coming from and what's driving it, and how we as a country are going to deal with the challenges that come both with expenditure and spending by the government of taxpayers' dollars, but also a discussion around how we raise revenue. And discussions around revenue aren't just about increasing taxes, as some of our opponents would like. It's actually about a discussion about how we rebase the tax system that properly reflects that. Because what we know is the real growth in welfare spending since the turn of the 20th century has been assistance mostly to an ageing population. Since 1999, welfare support for an ageing population has grown from $31.9 billion to about $61.7 billion in 2016 dollars. Similarly, total health expenditure has grown from $28.7 billion to around $71.2 billion. Not that all of that cost, I might add, is driven by Australia's ageing population, but a Productivity Commission report has found that 20% of a person's lifetime health expense is intensely focused at the end of a person's life. As a society, we of course need to assist those people who cannot assist themselves, but it has long been understood that supporting an ageing population will increasingly put more pressure on taxpayers, and particularly a diminishing taxpayer base. The trajectory is set because the share of Australians over the age of 65 will increase from around 15% of the population today to nearly 22% by 2054-2055. People retiring now around the age of 65 can have up to 30 or 40 years of life ahead of them. And unsurprisingly, they want security, and they should have it, particularly around government policy and programs to make sure that they can retire with dignity and confidence into their future. But yet at the same time, they'll receive pensions, aged care, health care and medicines during the most dependent period of their lives on taxpayer-funded support. Concurrently, the private wealth of many retirees is held in superannuation and rarely attracts income tax unless you're over the new refined thresholds that were introduced by this government, and unless they're extremely well off. Similarly, many pensioners pay little income tax as their income barely exceeds the current tax-free thresholds. The 2015 Intergenerational Report identifies the challenge that presents as we have a diminishing number of people who pay tax. That identifies the increasing pressure this will put on presently younger Australians. Currently, there are 4.5 people of working age for every person over the age of 65. By 2054-2055, it will drop to 2.7, and there will be a significant narrowing in the number of taxpayers. And that's why one of this year's most important budget measures is that everyday expenses such as health, education and welfare will be taken from revenue and not debt from 2018-19, and that the government should finally be back in surplus by 2021. The current budget will only stabilise debt. The challenge for all of future governments will be to start paying back that debt and ensuring the next generations are incentivised to work. But at the heart of it, we have to deal with the problems around the tax system and where revenue is coming from. And I spoke of this in my first speech to this parliament. that we need a substantial rebasing of the tax system to recognise, firstly, that we operate in an internationally competitive environment. And this is the fallacy and the absurdity of our political opponents who cry foul at the idea that you would reduce tax for companies. We live in a world where capital and labour is mobile. Get real. Recognise that we are going to have an increasing challenging and diminishing number of income that can come from company tax, particularly if other countries decide to go down the path of reducing their company tax to attract investment. And with that will go jobs. Similarly, we need a reduction in personal income tax rates, because in the end, firstly, labour is now mobile, and particularly skills are now mobile, and people will choose to work partly in the environments where they can seek to enjoy the most return from their effort. But in addition to that, we know what is actually happening out there in the economy. People, particularly those people who aren't on salaries working for other people, face choices. And they often will go out of their way to set up company structures and trusts to minimise their tax liabilities. Of course, the response from our political opponents will be simply to dismiss this issue and say, let's get rid of any structure that allows them to do it. But all they're doing is responding to incentives. If we want to see a situation where the government raises the revenue it needs, you need a rebasing of the tax system and a consistency across tax rates, whether it's consumption, company or personal taxes, to make sure that everybody is carrying their obligations, that all of the people who are employed out there, and there are thousands of them who are accountants and lawyers, to minimise people's tax liabilities, go off and find some productive purpose to grow the state of the economy and help businesses grow their profits and their economic opportunity, not simply to minimise their tax. There's a very good book, Deputy Speaker, that I would recommend anybody who hasn't had a chance to read it, and I know it probably sounds a bit dull, but it's titled For Good and Evil, The Impact of Taxes on the Course of Civilization by a fellow by the name of Charles Adams. And in it he goes through the history of taxation and how it can lead to the rise and fall of societies, it can drive incentives within communities and economies and deliver substantial differences in the trajectory of a nation. And that is the challenge that we as a country must face, whether we are going to tax appropriately and to focus on the trajectory that we want for our country, which is one that grows and builds the opportunity for the future for younger Australians. And particularly to quote at the end in his epilogue of Adams's book, he talks specifically about the broad themes that can be taken from the role of tax throughout history. And to quote him, first, it is the glaring fact that all good tax systems tend to go bad, and unless restrained by the people in some effective way, governments are unable to live with a good working, moderate tax system. To continue, second, the most challenging problem of our age is whether or not civilization can extract from with its own self-destructiveness, tax self-destructiveness. If we don't address that problem, our children in the next century will. The destructiveness is not just economic. It endangers more important matters of the human spirit, which goes to the heart of whether people can stand on their own 2 feet and enjoy the rewards from their effort, but also the calling to others to be able to contribute to our society and stand on their own 2 feet and celebrate their efforts and endeavours. And third, quote, the one common denominator of all good tax systems before they went bad has been moderation. The principle was given to us by the ancients as the ideal of the good life and of good government. To continue, Aristotle arranged a long list of moral qualities in triads. Virtue was a middle ground between extremes called vices. And the essential character of what Adams analyses by looking at the whole history of taxation is it should be simple, it should be consistent, it should be low, because that is the basis in which people will pay it. And if people do pay their taxes because they see them as fair and just, as a respectful recognition of their reward and their effort, you will get people doing what they appropriately need to do. But they also won't be distracted by creating artifices and structures that otherwise seek to advance minimising their tax obligations. But that requires reform, and a sort of conversation that unfortunately we can't have right now, because anything that involves a serious discussion around rebasing the tax system leads to the inevitable cries and shrill responses from those opposite, because they can't actually and don't understand how you have a proper discussion around tax and what's in the best interests of this country. Finally, just to surmise, there have been a number of people who have commented on this budget, particularly from what they describe as self-identified conservatives, and the problems they have with this budget for one reason or another. I'm a Liberal, Deputy Speaker, and I'm proud to be a Liberal, and I always will be. And one of the great follies of why I never describe myself as a conservative, though I do have conservative dimensions, is that when you describe yourself as a conservative, you define yourself by what you're against. And that allows others to define the agenda and to simply temper the speed at which they get there. That is why we must always be liberals.
Time.